This is a sphere. As you can see, light's coming in from the left. This is the brightest part of the sphere, and the darkest part of the sphere is on the right side. Because the sphere is round, the shadow is wrapping around this too. And as you can see, my hand is coming closer to it. You can see a little bit of light bouncing off my hand back into the shadow. That's called reflected light. There's midtones as well, from the shadow side to the highlight side, right in the middle, where it's got a little bit of both values combined. Not too bright, not too dark. And if I set this down onto a surface, there's also a cast shadow that is on this paper. So we're going to be drawing highlights, shadows, mid-grade, midtones, cast shadows, and some reflected light. Especially if I have some paper kind of going up a little bit towards the light, you can see how much reflected light there is. It's just on the other side of the shadow side, right on the far right, you can see. So that's called reflected light, cast shadow. There's the shadow there, midtones, and the highlight is the brightest part right there. We're going to attempt to draw something that looks a bit like that. So here I've got a little light, and it is kind of in front. The cast shadow is on the right side. As I bring the light towards the back, the cast shadow is going opposite of that light source. And we can put this in any direction. You can see the cast shadow is basically playing hide and seek from the light. Wherever the light is, the shadow's on the opposite side. So I think this is a good little viewpoint of our sphere. We're going to attempt to draw something that looks a bit like that. The highlight is on the left side. Closest to the light. The shadow is on the right side, furthest from the light. And the cast shadow is on the paper. You can see a little bit of that reflected light too, bouncing back off the white paper right up underneath that shadow line. And let's not forget the midtones. So let's begin. To get a sphere, it's a circle. So using a shoulder motion, trying not to keep my hands stuck to the paper too much, or my fingers doing this, because this makes kind of bumpy oval shapes. But to get a good round shape, I'll need to keep my shoulder in motion and my hands a little bit free to move on the paper. And I'm going to draw light as I can to start with. Actually here I'm just sort of practicing the shape, going around and around, feeling how it's going to perform. And when I think I've got it down, I'm going to do a little test and just dip my toe in the water. And it came out pretty good. And you can tweak it. You can move it a little bit around if you need to. Say you had a bumpy shape like this, you know that this needs to be rounded out there, so you can kind of make modifications with the sketch, each time sort of drawing a little differently. Once you're finished with that shape and you're pleased with what you've got, you can erase what you don't need. And all the time, try to keep everything very, very lightly drawn, so it is easy to erase. Okay, now we're going to establish a sense of background, because right now the circle is in the middle of nothing. I'm just going to add like a table back or some kind of horizon space there. And now that we've got our circle established here and a sense of background, we can start to put in the lights and the darks. Now that photograph showed the light coming in from the left side, creating a cast shadow on the right side. So I'm going to think about the roundness here and very lightly sort of making a sort of a curve, almost a crescent moon shape. And then using a very light pressure and not a very pointed pencil, because the more I scratch lines into it, the harder it's going to be to blend later on. But I'm going to ever so softly here just color in that sort of center area. I'm going to leave a little bit on this far right side blank to account for that reflected light that we saw in the photo. This is called cross-hatching, so I'm going in one direction here, lightly, and then going in a different direction, overlapping more colorations or kind of just scribbles, a very light scribble, to create a little bit of an X pattern. That's going to be easier for me to blend out later on. And if you need more soft transitions, you can do different diagonals as well to create more of a soft shade. All right, so that's going to be for the shadow. This here, the bright part, is called the highlight. And then down here on the ground, we're going to need some area of cast shadow. Because this is on a flat surface, I'm going to want to color or sketch out lines that are also horizontal or flat to equal that contour. The contour of this is round, so I want this to be in a round way. But since this is flat, I want this to be in a very flat manner. And if it's a little bit scribbly, you can do some cross-hatching over that. Again, very, 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 very lightly if you can. And then from here on out, we're going to use either a finger, or if you've got some blending tools here. This is just a little piece of paper rolled up really tightly. And it's nice since it can get into the little details, but you don't necessarily need to have one of these. You can also just use your finger. I apologize for the flimsy tables kind of moving around with me. If you do have one of these, you'll notice it gets a little bit darker than what you colored in. And the nice thing about these blending sticks is that they can get into small little details where your finger may have a little bit too much roundness to fit into small corners and things. But also they're not dirty. Like this has got a lot of graphite on it, but your fingers might have leftover lunch or other gross materials attached to them. So blending sticks are a little more sanitary. What I'm doing here is just trying to smooth out the difference between the darkest and the lightest. These are those mid-grades or those mid-tones here. And what I want to do here is also see what doesn't belong, which is these sketches from the first time we were drawing this circle, kind of crudely overlapping lines. I want to begin to erase them and just leave only the most important of the circle parts. So I actually just erased all of it, and I'm just going to lay in one kind of permanent line there. And then maybe add a little bit of contrast here. Might be a little bit extra dark down underneath there, where the light certainly can't get to it. And any scribblings that happened, you gotta try to smooth them out a little bit. And I would gradient this floor space too. This cast shadow could even have lightest to darkest going that way. And if you had too much, use your pencil as a drawing tool. You don't want the cast or the reflected light to equal the brightness of your highlight. And I remember in our example here, there was a really bright patch here, kind of almost like an eye right in this spot. So I'm going to try to make just a little bit more gray and just leave this very center place pure white. So another trick is to get some dirt from your shadow places and use that to paint on where you need more. And the trick is not to exaggerate too much. You don't want to over shade or over highlight anything. I mean, we're drawing a white sphere, so we don't want this thing to look like a gray sphere when we're done with it. But I do want to have a sense of that highlight. So using your eraser, you can even draw the highlight, that little bright part in the center. And then if you want to soften that edge a little bit, you can with the blender or your dirty Cheetos fingers or whatever you got stuck in there. Here's a little bit of a scribble. So we want to clean that up a little bit. Maybe reintroduce the missing lines here. And I was saying, you don't want this reflected light to equal the brightness of your highlight, so this is going to have to be a little bit gray over here, because you wouldn't expect that to be the brightest part. The brightest part can only be where the light is closest to it. And since this is just bouncing off of this table, it's not going to replicate the brightness of that direct light from the lamp that I had. So this is a sphere showing a cast shadow. This is the shadow itself on the form. The reflected light, these midtones, and the brightest of places is called the highlight. And to further finish your drawing off so it looks like it's in a place, you can also maybe add a little contrast in the background by shading in a little bit of the above wall space, or if this was the sky or whatever, you can do that. And these are a little bit busy, these lines I can see scribbling around, so another way to soften them, remember, crosshatch, go the other direction, and that'll sort of smooth things over a little bit. And finally come in with your finger or blender, see if you can get rid of those. And you can always erase if you add too much. This thing's never permanent. And I'm not really liking this much here, so you kind of erase as if you were drawing in reverse. And I'll even use the cross-hatching technique. And the final blend there. And we can probably wrap this thing up.